Now, a lot of the treatments would be a means to stimulate your central nervous system. The idea that if you're sick, your body's not working properly. We need to startle it back into a proper functioning. So we may do things like extract a tooth, or bleed you, or puke you, or purge you. Now, oftentimes people will hear about the formation of pus and think, well, this is an age before the antibiotics. And indeed, had we had every antibiotic known today, we'd have cast them all aside as worthless, because we're looking for rapid results and they just don't work that quickly. But an infection is not necessarily a death sentence in colonial days. It depends on where that infection's going. Small group our size, there's probably infection on 2 or 3 of us. I'm clumsy, I keep one pretty much all the time. But it gets down to what direction that infection's going to. If it's going to the inside, yes, you've got a true threat upon you. But if it's going to the outside, like perhaps that gut there, probably will be all right. So the infection doesn't mean that it's a death sentence. It really depends on how that infection is moving. All these changes, these improvements, came about as society changed. In an earlier age, your care after the battle was pretty much reserved for your wealth. I mean, with the fall of the Roman Empire, you don't see the common soldier getting care after a battle much. That's for your governor, your king, your person with money. But a few things happened to change that. One is fewer European armies are being filled with mercenaries, paid foreigners fighting for your country. Now, your nations are still using mercenaries, but they're not using as many to make their army. So there begins to develop this sense of this person was injured fighting for our collective country. We owe it to them to try to take care of them. So you see more people qualifying for medical care. And then you see the change in weaponry. You see an earlier age where your battlefield wound may have come from an arrow or a spear or a sword. And certainly there were impact weapons that would shatter a bone, but you don't see as many as what would come when black powder is pushing lead musket balls. So you wind up with more broken bones that are broken in a manner in which amputations are required. Point is, as weapons change, more injuries require an amputation, and at the same time, more of your fighting force qualify for medical care, and that leads to greater practice, greater observation, greater improvement. We even know on the part we talked about earlier with the separator, where they did not just come up with this idea and everything worked perfectly. There was trial and error with that. We know of surgeons who wrote about making the cut, slipping the separator in place, pulling back but pulling to the wrong direction. So instead of preserving flesh that would eventually come back and cover the tip of the bone, what they had was bone extending far beyond where the limb was. And in a great show of integrity, I would argue, that surgeon wrote that he feared his mistake would lead to the patient's death, and later came back and said, indeed, my fears were realized. How often are we going to document that we did something wrong and it caused someone to die? Some still would hold that much integrity, but I think most of us would want to write that a bit differently. I'm grateful that he wrote it, though, because it gives us that window, and otherwise I would think, all right, it was suggested, it was tried, and we had a new thing that worked great. It was still a learning process, like most that we pick up upon. We had a number of different medicinals that were used. A lot of them were used to stimulate the central nervous system. So for some of you that came in earlier, we talked about that more earlier, but it's the idea that you're sick, your body's not working good, we've got to startle it into a proper function. Some of us have grown up in the modern age with that. If you had an older relative that believed, all right, you're sick, you've got a fever, we're going to cover you with blankets and sweat that sickness out of you. That's 18th century as can be. If you had the relatives that thought you're sick, we need to make you throw up or go to the bathroom or both. That's 18th century. I don't remember Grandmama ever using the phrase stimulate the central nervous system, but she sure followed some of the practices of the age. So we're not completely away from some of that. Why would we want to raise blisters? We did it for different reasons. The one you've probably already guessed, stimulating that central nervous system, but also they believed in this age that fluid around your vital organs was a bad thing. Say around your heart or lungs. Most of our cultures were way too dirty to be able to do invasive surgery. That would be a death sentence. Well, we've all seen blisters in our hands, our feet. thought if we raise that fluid, that's got to be the same fluid, if we raise it to the surface of the body and then we lance it, we cut it and remove it, that's got to do some good. And folks, I don't recommend going home and trying it. It's not the same fluid, but I admire the thought process they put into it. They were looking for a way to accomplish what needed done. They just happened to get some things wrong. There was a misunderstanding in this age that you had more blood than you actually would have. So, about twice as much blood as what we would actually have is what they believed you had in your body. And if you're a wealthy person with many people tending to you, especially if they weren't communicating with one another very well, you might have quite a bit of blood taken from you. Certainly it was fatal for some, and debate about a number of early leaders dying as a result of that. Washington was being treated for what's referred to as an infected throat. Some believe that bloodletting was what killed him. Others believe the infected throat's what killed him. I won't pretend to know, but I do think that if you're suffering from such an illness and you're needing that oxygen-rich blood, you can make a pretty strong argument that the depletion of that oxygen-rich blood didn't help you anyway. But that's the bloodletting from the time of Fort Loudoun. It was definitely an age of great attention to the patient. They got a lot of things wrong, but they were certainly studying the patient. They were making those observations and trying to provide the best care. I would argue that it's the foundation of modern treatment today, even though a lot of things were wrong. We're no longer shaking an olive branch over your head saying you're sick because of your sin. We're realizing some really sinful people tend to live a long life and some really good people die far too young, so we're coming up with medical theories. Well, some of them were wrong, some of them were right, and so we're building on that process of gaining knowledge that is hopefully something that always stays at the forefront of treatment.